Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Fitness Education Series produced by the Australian Fitness Academy. It's like progressive overload for your brain. I'm your host, Tom Rock, and today's episode we're going to dive into the high intensity interval training versus steady state cardio. Is one better than the other? What's the differences? We're going to have a look at some research. Luke, who is going to jump on with me, is not in today, but he's going to jump on in a future podcast for sure, and we'll cover another interesting topic. But today's episode is on HIIT versus steady state. And these are two different types of cardiovascular training. So we've got continuous training, which is just basically long, slow distance, generally continuous movement. So generally modes of exercise like running, riding, swimming, rowing potentially, these sort of things that are done continuously for extended periods of time, generally a minimum of 20 minutes is your sort of continuous training. And then you've got your high intensity intervals, which is more like work to rest ratios, start, stop. You might do 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off, or it might be 2 minutes on, 1 minute off. There's lots of different ranges of intervals that are generally done at a higher intensity than you can maintain. Say that in a steady state run, you're going to be working at an intensity that you can maintain over a longer period of time. With HIIT training, your intensity is a lot higher during the exercise. Both modes are used in cardiovascular training and improving cardiovascular fitness. So in terms of being able to prescribe different types of cardiovascular fitness is always good. We'll talk about some of the research behind HIIT versus steady state, why you might pick one over the other, that sort of thing, as we go through, but hopefully you get a little bit out of this. I'll go through a few studies today and some of the interesting things that I found when looking into HIIT versus steady state, and I'll make sure I put a link to all these articles in the description, podcast description, so go in there and check it out. It was interesting once I started diving in. There's a lot of research on different aspects of HIIT versus cardiovascular or long slow distance training or steady state training or continuous training, and there's a lot of different outcomes and a lot of different methods, which we'll sort of talk about as we go through. So keep that in the back of your mind. And it was sort of just a big black hole of research that I sort of went down, but it was really, really cool. And we'll get to some of the interesting stuff that I thought was interesting as I went through it. But we'll start somewhere, and then we'll sort of try to come to a bit of a conclusion and thoughts at the end of the podcast. But the first study I'll touch on it's from 2016. It's called HIIT Enhances Endurance Performance and Aerobic Characteristics More Than High Volume Training in Trained Rowers. So this study looked at 19 well-trained rowers. They did 8 weeks of training. One group did 10 long, slow distance sessions per week, or your more volume heavy training. The second group did 8 of the long, slow distance or aerobic sessions with 2 HIIT sessions incorporated into it. And the HIIT sessions were 6 to 8 rounds of 2.5 minute intervals where they had all the, they obviously did fitness testing, and they did 2.5 minutes at 100% of their peak power output, and then their recovery, and then they would just recover or rest until their heart rate returned to 70% of its max. And then they would go again, and that would be their HIIT sessions. So again, this study sort of looked at HIIT training versus long slow distance, but the group that did HIIT also did 8 sessions of long slow distance, and they just had 2 sessions of HIIT, where the other group just had long slow distance. What they showed, or what the outcome was, is that the group that had the HIIT sessions involved had greater improvements in the 2,000 meter time trial, VO2 max, and peak power output at lactate threshold. So basically they could perform more work before they hit their lactate threshold, and would start to accumulate their lactate threshold. So this study concluded that 8 weeks of HIIT performed at 100% of peak power output is more effective than the long slow distance in improving performance in aerobic characteristics in well-trained rowers. So what they found was that if they were going to do 10 aerobic sessions with these athletes, the group that did all 10 aerobic sessions didn't improve as much as the group that did 8 aerobic but had 2 sessions where they did high intensity intervals. So I guess this first study sort of showed that HIIT potentially has some benefits. In this scenario, it did anyway. But there was a lot of training going on, and that sort of high-level athlete getting those HIIT sessions in. So that is one that showed that HIIT is more effective. The next study was called The Effects of High-Intensity Interval Training versus Moderate Intensity Continuous Training on Athletes' Aerobic Endurance Performance Parameters. So this study was a systematic review and a meta-analysis. So this type of research basically, they go through and look at a number of articles on the subject and basically put it into one analysis and one review, and then come to a conclusion based on a number of studies, which is generally what I sort of look to do if I'm researching a topic or looking into something. You read a whole range of literature and bring yourself to a conclusion. So what they sort of concluded at the end of this review was that they looked at papers that looked at sort of HIIT training versus continuous training over a number of weeks, and what they sort of showed that 1 to 3 weeks and 4 to 9 weeks of HIIT training was more effective in improving athletes' maximum oxygen uptake, or VO2 max. However, 10 weeks or more, there was no significant difference. So what I guess the outcome or the result of this takeaway potentially is that in the short term, HIIT potentially helps improve aerobic performance, or VO2 max, better. But if someone trains for 10 weeks or more, then there's no difference. The improvements in aerobic capacity are the same no matter if they're doing HIIT or they're doing steady state. So again, we'll sort of talk about what we might take away from that, but HIIT might be effective if I've got a shorter time frame, but if I don't like HIIT training and I like long, slow distance training or moderate intensity continuous training, then I can do that. And in the end, there's not going to be any difference. But if someone's got maybe a quick time frame where they need to improve their VO2 max, maybe HIIT is a better option potentially. So that was sort of an interesting outcome of that one. Another study I read through was it looked at 3 different types of workouts. So it was called 3 workouts: interval training, intermittent training, and steady state training for improvement of VO2 max and BMI. This study used younger participants. So it was 30 young 15 to 17-year-old amateur soccer athletes. They did some HIIT training, or they did long intervals, which was sort of more 45 seconds on, 25 seconds off. I think the short one was 20 on, 10 off, but they sort of progressed that a little bit as they went through the program. And the steady state group, they said was steady state. It was sort of more like longer intervals. They do like 500 meters to 1,000 meter intervals, rest, and then go again. So they were it was steady state, but it was sort of your longer type intervals. What they found in this one is they didn't see any significant difference between groups on VO2 max or BMI. So again, they looked at a couple of different training methods, and they saw improvements in the VO2 max, but not different between groups. So whatever aerobic training they implemented with these 30 young athletes, there was no difference whether they did HIIT, the longer intervals, or the more steady state type longer intervals or steady state that they were doing as well. So this study didn't show any difference between HIIT versus long slow distance. And probably one of the last studies we'll go talk about just in this first section where we discuss is HIIT more effective was called The Effect of High Intensity Interval Training versus Steady State on Aerobic and Anaerobic Capacity. And this study was done on untrained college-age subjects, so probably 18 to mid-20s, potentially college-age students, college-age subjects. They did 8 weeks of training. Group 1 did steady state, so 20 minutes of steady state. Group 2 did Tabata, which is 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off. And then Group 3 did 30 seconds on, 60 seconds off. They had some different intensities there, but that was relatively how the HIIT worked. So each subject did 24 sessions during the 8 weeks. So they did 3 sessions a week based on their training group. What they didn't really show, they showed there was no significant differences between groups. So there were significant increases in VO2 max in all groups. So all groups, each training session, no matter what they did, steady state, Tabata, or the longer intervals, all groups showed an increase in VO2 max. So they're all effective, but between groups, there was no significant difference. So again, this one sort of showed in terms of performance measures and performance outcomes, all training elicited improvements, but no difference between steady state and HIIT training. One of the interesting takeaways that this study did look at, they also looked at how much the subjects enjoyed the sessions. And what they found was that the Tabata protocol was significantly less enjoyable than the steady state and the longer intervals. So this study showed that the subjects didn't enjoy HIIT as much as they did the long, slow distance or the steady state. So steady state potentially for these subjects was more enjoyable. They also showed that the enjoyment of all protocols declined across the 8-week study. So no matter what group you were in, at the end of the 8-week study, your enjoyment for whatever you're doing had dropped off, which I think was an interesting find. And I think it sort of shows the importance when you are programming or designing programs, whether it's HIIT or continuous. If you do anything for an extended period of time, potentially your client's enjoyment is going to drop off. And we want to make sure our clients are enjoying training, because that's going to help them turn up every week and stick to the program. So finding out what type of exercise your client enjoys is a really important part of prescribing any program, whether it's resistance or cardio. It is really important. And even if they say they like steady state training better than HIIT, potentially after a period of time, adding in some HIIT and some variety may be a good idea to start talking to them about. So it does stay interesting, or they can change it up a bit, because this study sort of demonstrates that no matter what they do, if they do it for an extended period of time, their enjoyment is going to decrease. So that's again why variety potentially plays a big role in accountability and making sure your clients are sticking to their program in the long run. So that's a very small snapshot of some HIIT versus steady state literature. What I found when researching it was that it's very hard to get a clear outcome. We had one that showed there was a difference, and that was in the elite rowing group, and they were doing a lot of training, and they just added in 2 HIIT sessions on top of, instead of they had 8 aerobic, 2 HIIT instead of 10 aerobic, and that showed a difference. So I think in certain circumstances, HIIT may be beneficial and you may see better improvements in your VO2 max or your performance than just doing steady state training. However, it's hard to find a lot of research that is the same. So some studies will show differences, others will show there's no significant difference, but they use different subjects and they use different training methods. So their intervals may have been different lengths and different intensities. So how that applies to your specific situation or your client specific situation might not be applicable. So even though these elite rowers found a difference, that doesn't mean if I go out and do 2 HIIT sessions is better than me doing 8 aerobic sessions, because we saw the research on the soccer players who did different types of training, and they didn't see any significant difference no matter what they were doing. So I think it's interesting, and you could pour through a number of different articles and find different stuff on whether HIIT was more effective than steady state. But it comes down to goals in the end. I also think if someone's training for a sport that requires them to sort of be more start and stop or reach those higher intensities, HIIT's obviously going to be important. If someone's training for more like a half marathon or something, steady state's probably more similar to or more specific to their training goal. However, probably that rowing study shows that having some HIIT in there is going to help improve that VO2 max and improve their performance. So doing all steady state might be doing a disservice to your client if you are training him for a half marathon or something that's lower intensity. Having some higher intensity training sessions is probably not a bad thing either, is probably what I would take away from that. Some of the other cool things that I sort of came across when I was looking at this is just some other thoughts in regards to how HIIT is applied. And HIIT's not always, obviously we've talked a lot about performance outcomes and VO2 max, but that's not always the case. For example, this study that I looked at from 2023 was called Effects of High Intensity Training and Continuous Endurance Training on Aerobic Capacity and Body Composition in Recreational Active Runners. And what they sort of looked at here was an interesting one. They looked at HIIT versus endurance, but it was more in the fact that these were recreational runners looking, I'm pretty sure they were looking to do a half marathon or something similar. And it basically looked at two different ways of training. So they had what was called sort of the weekend group and the weeknight group. So the weekend group did 2.5 hours worth of training on the weekend. So on Saturday and Sunday, they did continuous training. So Saturday was a continuous session and Sunday was a continuous session. So they did 2.5 hours of continuous training on the weekend. The other group did 4 nights a week plus a sort of a 30-minute endurance session. So they did HIIT training 3 nights a week, one sort of moderate intensity session plus a 5th sort of light 30-minute run. So they did 2.5 hours of training as well, but they split that up over the 5 weeknights. So this is a cool study that sort of potentially looks at two different people. So people who are work and are busy during the week and can't fit in any sort of, I guess, running training during the week, and it gets to the weekend and they want to train for their event, say a half marathon, versus the people who are busy on weekends but have half an hour a night during the week to train and get fit. And what situation is better? Do they both work? Is it fine? And the results indicate that high intensity training as well as continuous exercise led to significant improvements in both body composition, resting heart rate, and aerobic power with around 2.5 hours of weekly training. So no matter what they did, either they just trained on the weekend or they split their training over the weeknights, they were both fine and they both improved their aerobic capacity. There was slightly higher cardiorespiratory benefits in the high intensity group, but both sort of training methods were promoted health. So really they sort of showed that in order to enhance your aerobic fitness and general health, either option would be fine. You can train on the weekends or you can train for sort of shorter sessions, but each weeknight more regularly. So it's a good sort of, I think I like this study just to show that both situations work, and no matter what your circumstances are or your client's circumstances are, you can sort of develop a program that will suit them. And this sort of shows that they're going to benefit no matter what. So you've still got to make sure you structure it well, start the intensity and volume at where they can handle it. But if they can only train on the weekends, there's options to build up and still improve their health and aerobic fitness if they can only train on weekends. So that's a cool little study. The next study, second last one that we'll go through, is just high intensity in training is not superior to continuous aerobic training in reducing body fat. And this was another systematic review and meta-analysis of sort of more clinical trial stuff. And they reviewed the literature on HIIT versus long slow distance on reducing body fat. And what they sort of showed is HIIT is not superior to continuous aerobic training in reducing body fat or abdominal visceral fat in individuals characterized by excess weight. So these are sort of weight loss clients or weight loss studies they're looking at. However, HIIT showed beneficial effects in cardiorespiratory fitness, total cholesterol, and fasting blood glucose when compared to continuous aerobic training. So there was no difference in reducing body fat or the visceral fat. However, the people that did HIIT training did show slightly more beneficial results in terms of fitness and cholesterol and fasting blood glucose, which can potentially be a sort of lead to type 2 diabetes, and things can be a risk factor potentially. So that was an interesting one. Again, it shows that you're going to get benefit from both, but this sort of study shows that potentially if a client is capable of doing HIIT or some higher intensity training, it potentially is going to show slightly more beneficial improvements in cholesterol and blood glucose and cardiorespiratory fitness. Again, a different cohort of clients, but shows that it is applicable and maybe beneficial. Again, it's important to understand that people should build up to high intensity training and not go straight from doing nothing to all of a sudden doing high intensity intervals, but progressing them towards that and then including some of their program may be healthy for a client to do once they can do it. And the last study that I thought was really interesting is called Exercise Mitigates Sleep Loss Induced Changes in Glucose Tolerance, Mitochondrial Function, Sarcoplasmic Protein Synthesis, and sort of the daily rhythms of your body. So this was a really cool one. They looked at healthy male clients that got normal sleep, so 8 hours in bed per night. They had a group that did sleep restriction, so they only got 4 hours of bed, 4 hours in bed for 5 nights in a row. And the third group did sleep restriction, the same 4 hours in bed, 5 nights in a row, but they did 3 HIIT sessions within that period of time, that 5-night period. And this was really cool. And what they showed is, so the outcome was that sleep loss reduces glucose tolerance. It also showed reductions in mitochondrial respiratory function. So your mitochondria is basically the powerhouse of your cells. So a lot of your ATP gets resynthesized using the mitochondria. So the better the mitochondria function, the better our body produces energy. But basically, sleep loss or sleep restriction reduced mitochondrial function and also reduced protein synthesis. What the study showed, though, is that if the group that did sleep restriction but the 3 HIIT sessions didn't show the reductions in protein synthesis and mitochondrial function. So the detrimental effects that were observed via sleep restriction weren't observed in the group that performed the HIIT training during the period of sleep restriction. So a cool little study that sort of shows a different benefit of HIIT training, and there's probably a lot more to research within this one and keep looking at. It was a very interesting study. But it's shows another sort of way to apply HIIT training if someone is going through, a client or yourself is going through a period of sort of restricted sleep, that you can't get as much sleep. HIIT training is potentially beneficial for mitigating some of the things your body's going to go through because of sleep restriction. So that was a really cool study. So I think, an interesting way to apply HIIT training and look at what it does or the effect it can have on the body. So that's sort of the run through of some of the literature I found. Again, it was an interesting hole to jump down because there's so much out there, and a lot of the HIIT stuff, it's potentially specific to groups or the type of client you're training, or yourself, or circumstances, relative to their current fitness levels, when they can train, when they can't train. All those sort of things we'll need to take into account. I think session length is a big thing. So continuous training will generally potentially take longer than your HIIT session. So going for a 30, 40, 50-minute run is obviously going to take longer than potentially get the same benefit maybe from a 15 to 20-minute HIIT session if you're short on time. But what a client enjoys is also going to come into that as well. And if you're doing HIIT and you're running, or you're doing sprint intervals and things like that, Um, that takes a fair amount of sort of muscular force and joint stress, and recovery is involved in that as well. So if you're lifting weights, or you're doing lower body sessions, trying to fit that in around your running is also important if you're doing sort of high intensity stuff that's sort of load bearing. But there's lots to take into account, and plenty more research you could look at to try, I guess, ascertain if HIIT is better than steady state. I'm sure there's no right or wrong. It will depend on circumstances, it will depend on the goal, it will depend on the outcome that you're looking for. But if it is a sport-orientated goal or a fitness-orientated goal, making it as specific as possible to the event is definitely important. But find out what your client enjoys, and learn a range of different protocols and tools as well. I think that was the hard thing about looking through the literature is some HIIT would use like Tabata, which is like 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off for 4 minutes, and do that a few times. Others would do like 2 minute intervals with 1 minute off, or there's just a whole range of different ways that HIIT or high intensity interval training is applied and can be applied, and those different interval lengths will have different effects on which energy system is used, which energy system is predominant. Are we looking at improving the lactate threshold? What are we looking at improving? So that's a whole other topic to dive into potentially in terms of what outcome are you looking for from your aerobic training. But I think this initial sort of podcast sort of shows there are benefits of HIIT in terms of potentially performance outcome VO2 max, or it's definitely not worse than long, slow, steady state training or continuous training. And there's potentially some health benefits there from HIIT as well in terms of lowering cholesterol. And what else do we have? Lowering cholesterol, even the sleep restriction stuff was really cool. Fasting blood glucose, all these sort of things. So depending on circumstances, I think it is going to be beneficial for clients to potentially build into their program once they sort of progress towards that intensity. But yeah, hopefully you got a bit out of that, guys. Again, all those links to some of those articles will be in the description below. If you have any questions or thoughts on this podcast, please send an email to tom@afa.com.au. If you find any interesting articles, or you see something, you're following this through, send me an article that you find, or send me whatever you want. Happy to sort of bring it up, keep the discussion going. It'd be really cool. If you've got any other topics you want me to discuss or any questions, send an email as well. Other than that, guys, hope you have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you all soon.